As the sun began to set over the bustling city streets, casting long shadows between towering buildings, two patrol officers were completing their routine evening rounds. The day had been relatively quiet. A few traffic violations, a minor dispute at a local convenience store, and the usual paperwork that came with it all. That's when they spotted a sleek black SUV making an unusual turn at a yellow light. Officer Thompson reached for the radio while his partner, Officer Chen, flipped on their cruiser's lights. It was just another traffic stop, or so they thought. The SUV pulled over smoothly into a nearby parking lot, its tinted windows revealing nothing about the driver inside. As they approached the vehicle, following their standard protocol, neither officer could have imagined how this seemingly ordinary moment would become one of the most humbling experiences of their careers. The driver's window rolled down with a soft mechanical whir, revealing a well-dressed African-American woman in her mid-40s. Her calm demeanor and professional attire didn't quite match their usual traffic stops, but they proceeded as trained. "License and registration, please," Officer Thompson requested, flashlight beam cutting through the growing dusk. What happened next would become a story shared in break rooms and precinct gatherings for years to come. As the woman reached for her credentials, she maintained an enigmatic smile that somehow made both officers slightly uncomfortable. There was something familiar about her, but neither could quite place it. "Officers," she began, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made them both straighten unconsciously. "I believe we haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet." She handed over her license and registration with practiced ease, along with another card that made Officer Chen's eyes widen considerably. The air suddenly felt charged with a different kind of tension. Officer Thompson's flashlight beam wavered slightly as realization began to dawn. Their routine traffic stop had just become anything but routine. Here they were, having pulled over the very person who would be giving them their assignments and evaluating their performance starting next Monday morning. Through the precinct grapevine, they'd heard rumors about the new chiefs starting soon. There had been talk about progressive changes coming to their department, about new leadership that would bridge gaps between law enforcement and the community. What they hadn't known was that their new chief had specifically requested to spend her first week before officially starting by experiencing the city as an ordinary citizen. The woman's smile widened slightly as she watched the officers process this information. "I was actually on my way to survey the neighborhood," she explained, her tone professional yet warm. "I believe in understanding a community from ground level before attempting to serve it from behind a desk." This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was a moment that would challenge preconceptions, reshape perspectives, and ultimately transform their entire precinct. As both officers stood there, their minds racing with implications, they couldn't help but wonder, how many other assumptions had they made during their years of service? How many times had they let first impressions cloud their judgment? What happened next would not only change their approach to law enforcement, but would also spark a conversation about community policing that would ripple through departments across the country. But first, they had to navigate this unexpected encounter that had turned their ordinary evening shift into an extraordinary lesson in humility and leadership. The story of what unfolded in those next few minutes would become legendary within the department, but more importantly, it would become a catalyst for change that nobody saw coming. Officer Thompson cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how dry it had become. "Ma'am, I apologize for the stop. If we had known—" His voice trailed off as the new chief raised her hand, gently but firmly cutting off his apology. "Don't apologize for doing your job, officer," she said, stepping out of her vehicle with a grace that commanded respect. "I made that turn a bit hastily, and you responded exactly as you should have." Her tailored blazer caught the last rays of sunlight as she straightened up. 20 years of law enforcement experience was evident in her bearing, from the way she carried herself to how she assessed her surroundings with a quick, practiced glance. The chief's path to this moment had been anything but conventional. Rising through the ranks in one of the country's toughest precincts, she'd earned her stripes handling everything from domestic disputes to major crime operations. But what set her apart wasn't just her impressive arrest record or her advanced degrees in criminal justice and psychology. It was her innovative approach to community policing. As she stood there in the parking lot with her two officers, she shared a story that would later become a cornerstone of her leadership philosophy. "When I first started as a rookie," she began, leaning slightly against her SUV, "I made a traffic stop that changed my entire perspective on law enforcement. The driver was a retired teacher who had devoted 40 years to educating kids in our toughest neighborhoods. She gave me a lesson that day that no police academy could teach." Officers Thompson and Chen found themselves drawn into her story, momentarily forgetting the awkwardness of their situation. The chief's voice carried the weight of experience, but also a warmth that made her words resonate deeply. She described how that retired teacher had shown her that every interaction between law enforcement and the community was an opportunity, not just to enforce the law, but to build understanding. The parking lot had grown darker now, their conversation illuminated by streetlights and the still flashing lights of the patrol car. Other vehicles occasionally passed by, their drivers slowing down curiously at the sight of what appeared to be an unusually cordial traffic stop. Each passing car seemed to underscore the public nature of their work, how every interaction was potentially a chance to either strengthen or strain community relations. "You know," the chief continued, her expression thoughtful, "tomorrow morning, I'm supposed to give a speech at my official introduction ceremony. I've been struggling with what to say, how to express my vision for this precinct. But maybe," she paused, looking between the two officers, "maybe this encounter is exactly what I needed to understand where to begin." The tension from earlier had transformed into something else entirely, anticipation, perhaps, or the sense that they were standing on the threshold of significant change. But as another patrol car pulled into the parking lot, responding to what they thought was a routine backup call, the situation was about to become even more interesting. The chief's phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. The screen's glow illuminated her face as she read what appeared to be an urgent message. Her expression shifted subtly, years of crisis management experience evident in how quickly she assessed whatever information she just received. "Officers," she said, her tone shifting to one of professional urgency, "I believe we're about to have an opportunity to put some of these principles into immediate practice. There's a situation developing downtown that requires a different kind of approach." She paused, watching the newly arrived patrol car's officers approaching with confused expressions. What she would say next would challenge everything these officers thought they knew about handling crisis situations. The chief's phone displayed details of a delicate situation unfolding at the downtown community center. A group of teenagers had barricaded themselves inside after a heated confrontation with the center's security guard. Initial reports suggested they were armed, but something about the situation wasn't adding up. The regular protocol would have SWAT rolling in with full tactical gear, but the chief saw an opportunity to demonstrate a different approach. "Here's what we know," she explained to the 4 officers now gathered around her. "These kids are from our district. They've been using the community center's basketball court after hours for months without incident. Tonight, something changed." Her eyes scanned the message updates coming in. "The security guard is new, hired just last week. He has a history of escalating minor situations." Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably, remembering similar calls that had ended with unnecessary arrests and damaged community relations. The chief noticed his reaction and nodded knowingly. "You've seen how these situations typically play out, haven't you?" she asked. Without waiting for an answer, she continued, "Tonight, we're going to handle this differently." The drive downtown was tense, with the chief riding alongside Officers Thompson and Chen while the other patrol car followed. As they approached the community center, they could see several patrol units already on scene, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. A small crowd had gathered behind the hastily established police line, many recording with their phones. The scene commander approached their vehicle, surprise evident on his face as the chief stepped out. "Ma'am, I didn't expect. We were about to request SWAT." He gestured toward the building where shadows could be seen moving past the windows. "We've got at least 6 juveniles inside, possibly armed. They're not responding to our attempts to communicate." The chief surveyed the scene, noting the growing crowd of concerned parents and community members. The media would arrive any minute. This situation could either become tomorrow's headline about another violent confrontation between police and minority youth, or it could become something entirely different. "Lower your weapons," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made even veteran officers comply immediately. She removed her blazer, revealing a simple white blouse underneath. "Officer Thompson, I want you to come with me. The rest of you clear the perimeter. No tactical veer, no show of force." The scene commander started to protest, citing protocol and safety concerns, but the chief held up her hand. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is show we're human first, officers second." She pulled out her phone, quickly typing a message. "I just sent for someone who might help us understand what's really going on here." As if on cue, an elderly man hurried through the police line, his weathered face creased with concern. The chief greeted him with evident respect. "Mr. Washington, thank you for coming so quickly. You've been running youth programs here for 30 years. Talk to me about these kids." What happened next would challenge every conventional wisdom about handling hostile situations. As the chief and Mr. Washington approached the community center's entrance, with Officer Thompson following at a distance, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The outcome of this unconventional approach would either vindicate the chief's philosophy or become a cautionary tale about breaking protocol. Through the glass doors, they could see the teenagers watching their approach, their faces a mix of fear and defiance. The chief reached for the door handle, knowing that what she was about to do went against every standard procedure in the book. But sometimes, she believed, the biggest risks carried the greatest potential for change. Just as the chief reached for the door handle, a loud crash echoed from inside, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Several officers instinctively drew their weapons, but the chief's raised hand kept them in check. Through the glass doors, they could see that one of the teenagers had knocked over a trophy case, seemingly in panic rather than aggression. "Chief," Officer Thompson whispered urgently, "there's something we just learned about the security guard. He didn't just escalate situations at his previous jobs. He was fired from 2 positions for excessive force against minors. That information wasn't in his initial background check." The chief's expression hardened as she processed this new information, but her next move surprised everyone. She pulled out her phone and called someone on speaker. "Detective Rivera, remember that case we discussed this morning about missing equipment from the youth program?" The detective's voice crackled through the speaker, confirming that several $1,000s worth of sports equipment had disappeared over the past month. Suddenly, the pieces started falling into place. Mr. Washington's eyes widened with recognition. "The donations," he said quietly. "Last week, we received a large donation of new basketball equipment. The kids were so excited." He trailed off, looking troubled. "But yesterday, it all vanished. The new security guard said it must have been stolen after hours." Inside, the teenagers had grown quiet, watching the adults through the glass with a mixture of fear and something else, desperation to be heard. The chief noticed one of them, a tall boy wearing a basketball jersey, clutching what looked like a phone. He wasn't holding it like a weapon. He was holding it like evidence. "Thompson," the chief said quietly, "I want you to run the security guard's name through the system again, but this time, cross-reference it with any reported thefts from youth centers in other districts." She turned to Mr. Washington. "These kids weren't breaking in to cause trouble, were they?" "They were trying to prove something." Before anyone could respond, multiple media vans pulled up to the scene, their bright lights illuminating the parking lot like daylight. The situation had just become even more complicated. Any misstep now wouldn't just affect the department. It would be broadcast across every news channel by morning. The chief made a decision that would later be debated in police academies across the country. She removed her badge and gun, handing them to Officer Thompson. "Call Detective Rivera," she instructed. "Tell her to bring the case files for those equipment thefts, and get me the footage from the community center security cameras from the past week." Mr. Washington stepped forward. "Chief, what you're thinking. It's dangerous. These kids are scared, and scared people can be unpredictable." The chief's response was interrupted by another crash from inside, but this time it was accompanied by a shout that changed everything. "We have proof." The tall boy with the phone had moved closer to the door, his hand trembling as he held up his device. On the screen, they could see what appeared to be security footage, but before they could make out what it showed, the power in the community center suddenly cut out, plunging the building into darkness. In the chaos that followed, multiple voices started shouting at once. The media crews rushed forward with their cameras. The crowd pressed against the police line, and somewhere in the darkness, a door slammed. The chief's voice cut through the chaos with calm authority. Nobody moves. This just became much bigger than a simple break-in. In the darkness, the chief's voice remained steady as she called out, "Listen up. Everyone stay exactly where you are. Turn your phone flashlights on, but keep them pointed down." The darkness lit up with dozens of soft glows from both inside and outside the building. Through the glass doors, they could see the teenagers huddled together, their faces illuminated by their phone screens. "We have it all recorded," the tall boy shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "He's been stealing the equipment and selling it online. We tracked the posts." Just then, Officer Chen's voice crackled over the radio. The security guard had been spotted trying to leave through the back entrance. Within moments, they heard the sound of running feet and a brief scuffle. The backup generator hummed to life, bringing dim emergency lighting to the community center. The chief seized this moment. "I'm coming in," she announced, "and I want to see that evidence." She turned to Mr. Washington. "Would you join me? These kids know and trust you." As they stepped through the doors, the teenagers backed away, except for the tall boy who stood his ground, phone still extended. What they saw on that phone screen changed everything. The security footage showed the guard systematically removing equipment late at night, but there was more. The final clip showed him threatening the teenagers when they confronted him earlier that evening, his aggressive behavior far beyond any reasonable response to kids using a basketball court. "He said nobody would believe us." A younger teen spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said we just look like troublemakers." The chief's expression softened as she understood the full picture. These weren't delinquents causing trouble. They were young people standing up against injustice the only way they knew how. Officer Thompson appeared at the door. "Chief, we've got him, and you're going to want to see this." He held up the security guard's phone, which was still open to an online marketplace. The listings showed not just equipment from their community center, but from 3 others across the city. The guard had been running a sophisticated theft operation, taking advantage of his position to target youth programs in underserved communities. The chief turned to the teenagers. "You took a huge risk tonight," she said, her tone both firm and understanding. "But you also showed incredible bravery and resourcefulness. Next time, and I want you to remember this, you can come to me directly. That's why I'm here." As they led the teenagers out of the building, the media crews surged forward, cameras flashing. But before any questions could be asked, Mr. Washington stepped up to the microphone. "Tonight, these young people taught us all a valuable lesson about justice and courage. They could have walked away, but they chose to stand up for their community." The chief's phone buzzed one final time. Reading the message, a smile spread across her face. "Well," she announced to the gathered officers, "it seems our young investigators here did even more than they realized. The serial numbers from the recovered equipment match items stolen from youth centers in 3 different states. We just broke open a multi-state theft ring." Looking at Officers Thompson and Chen, who had initiated this entire chain of events with a simple traffic stop, the chief added, "Sometimes the most important police work happens when we stop and listen, when we look beyond our assumptions." She paused, then smiled. "And sometimes the best lessons about leadership come when you're pulled over for making a slightly questionable turn." As the crowd began to disperse and the teenagers were reunited with their relieved parents, one young officer asked, "Chief, did you know? When we pulled you over, did you already know about what was happening here?" She turned to him with that same enigmatic smile from earlier in the evening. "Let's just say," she replied, "sometimes the best way to understand your community is to become part of it first." In the days that followed, the story of that eventful night spread far beyond the precinct. The community center became a symbol of something larger, a testament to what could happen when law enforcement and community members worked together, when trust bridged the gap between badges and basketball courts. The chief kept her promise to the teenagers. Instead of facing charges for breaking into the community center, they were honored at a special ceremony for their role in uncovering the theft ring. More importantly, she established a youth advisory council, giving young people a direct line of communication with law enforcement. The tall boy who had recorded the evidence became its first chairperson. Officer Thompson and Chen found themselves assigned to a new community engagement unit, their traffic stop becoming a teaching moment in the department's training programs. Sometimes the best policing happens when we're proved wrong, Thompson would often say during these sessions, sharing how a routine traffic stop had challenged his own preconceptions. Mr. Washington's youth program received an unexpected windfall, not just replacement equipment, but a grant for expansion. The recovered evidence had led to arrests across multiple states, and the civil forfeiture funds were channeled back into the communities that had been victimized. Basketball courts that had fallen silent came alive again with the sound of bouncing balls and young voices. 1 month after the incident, the chief stood before a gathered crowd at the community center. The renovated facility gleamed under new lights, and the trophy case had been restored, now featuring a simple plaque that read, "Courage comes in many forms. Trust begins with understanding." She spoke about transformation, not just of a police department or a community center, but of perspectives. "When I first arrived in this precinct," she said, addressing the mixed crowd of officers and community members, "I could have walked in with my badge displayed and my authority announced. Instead, I chose to experience our streets the way our community does. That traffic stop." She smiled at Officers Thompson and Chen in the audience. It wasn't just coincidence. Every interaction between law enforcement and our community is an opportunity to build trust, to challenge assumptions, and to remember that we're all part of the same community. The teenagers who had risked so much to expose the truth sat in the front row, wearing brand new basketball jerseys. Their parents beamed with pride, now seeing their children not as troublemakers, but as young leaders who had stood up for their community. The chief had made sure their college applications included recommendation letters detailing their integrity and courage. As the ceremony concluded, a young girl approached the chief with a question that brought the room to silence. "Do you think things will stay different now?" The chief knelt down to meet her eyes, speaking not just to her but to everyone present. "Change isn't about one night or one event," she replied. "It's about the choices we make every day after. It's about remembering that trust is earned in small moments, in traffic stops and basketball games, in listening when others speak, and in having the courage to stand up for what's right." That evening, as the sun set over the community center, the sound of basketballs echoing through the gym mixed with the chatter of officers and teenagers sharing stories and snacks. Outside, patrol cars drove by with their lights off, not searching for trouble, but watching over their community with a new understanding. The chief's vision of community policing wasn't just a policy anymore. It had become a reality, built on trust, respect, and the courage to see beyond first impressions. The story of that traffic stop and what followed became more than just a tale of mistaken assumptions. It became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a simple moment of understanding, when we take the time to look past our badges and titles to see the humanity we all share.